Thank you all so much for turning out today. I wouldn't have come to hear myself, except that I have to be here. Okay. This is a kind of fateful day because it follows Paris last month and Denmark yesterday, day before. And the discussion that we are having should really be called the strange comeback of political religion. When I began studying international politics, world affairs, I've done that most of my life, we never worried too much about religion as a political force. We knew that in the historic past, many religions had a big political agenda, but that seemed long gone. But now, in recent times, there has been an amazing comeback. The rise and the fall, and now the resurrection of political religion. Okay. Let me look back in order to look forward. The major world's religions have, as you well know, ancient histories. Judaism and Hinduism go back well over 4,000 years. This is the Jewish year 5775 right now. Shintoism, the national Japanese faith of kami spirits and ancestors, goes back about 3,000 years. Buddhism and Confucianism go back about 2,600 years. Christianity 2,000 years, Islam about 1,400 years. Originally, most of these faiths had strong political ambitions. They wanted to shape their societies, and they sought to do that through dominating governments and imposing their religious rules on the countries where they existed. In those early days, there were two kinds of religious political agendas. There was first a domestic agenda. Religions wanted to establish their belief and their social practices in their own countries, to make sure there was not much room for other beliefs in their homelands. And to do that, there was only one way, that was to get political power. So they sometimes clashed with governments of their homelands and demanded special benefits and concessions. And for the most time, they got them. Christian rules were imposed on Christian countries, mainly in Europe. Hindu rules were established in most of what is today's India. Okay. Islamic rules were part of the ways of Islamic states, and there was no separation of church and state there. Sometimes there were places for other faiths, but it was uncomfortable to be of the non-establishment faith in those countries. That was the kind of religious and political agenda that many of these religions had domestically. Okay. Religion as a governing strategy. But there was another kind of religious political agenda, an international agenda, that was advocated largely by the two great missionary religions which sought to go far beyond their homeland, the missionary religions of Christianity and Islam. Christianity from its start, Islam from its start, not only wanted Christian and Islamic societies at home, they wanted to extend their beliefs and social practices to areas well outside their homelands, to foreign lands, to foreign peoples. Christian priests and armies took the message and their ideas abroad, especially after the conversion of the Roman Empire to Christianity in 312 AD. Christian agendas outside the Christian homelands were backed by the most powerful state at the time, the Roman Empire. From the birth of Islam, especially after the death of the Prophet Muhammad in the early 7th century, Islam went abroad in a big way with a large international agenda, imposing its faiths on other areas. Inevitably, this of course led to a clash between Christian forces and Islamic forces. The invasion and occupation of Spain and parts of Eastern Europe by Islamic warriors, crusades in the Middle East by Christian armies. For the most part, both faiths, wherever they conquered, enforce their rules, enforce their ideas on the social and political societies that they took over. About 1500 AD, the Islamic challenge began to weaken in Europe. The Christian and at that time essentially Catholic prescription dominated Europe and later was exported to the colonies of the European powers in the Americas and Asia. In Europe itself, big religious wars took place about 1500s, early 1600s, because a new religion had arisen, the Protestantism of Martin Luther, and the old Catholic powers contested it, each wanting political power beyond their religious belief. These were as much political wars as they were religious wars. Always the idea was not only territory, but imposing religious and political agendas. Okay? Through laws, through social practices, through persuasion and persecution, through fear, through threats of punishment. Some kings and civil authorities resisted this, and the struggle between church and state for domination of society grew. This was predominantly a struggle in Europe in the Middle Ages. In the Islamic age areas, church and state were closely joined, and therefore there was no conflict between church and state. The Islamic agenda became the political agenda. And after about 1600, Islam didn't expand very much outside the Middle East. What about other religions? In the old Jewish kingdoms, there was always a kind of separation between church and state. Prophets were never kings. In fact, they corrected kings. The classic case is the prophet Nathan, who berated King David for not behaving properly. Okay. The separation of church and state existed in Hindu society. Priests could not become kings. In Buddhist societies, Confucianism had some conjoining of church and state, but the kings always controlled the political agenda. Okay. By about the late 1700s, religious political forces began to lose strength, and secularism in politics gained. This was the result of the rise of nationalism. New loyalties to countries arose, the influence of the Enlightenment in the Western world, the impact of Darwin, later Freud, and to some extent Marx, pushed religion out of the political arena. Science and secular education diminished the role of religious politics. Okay. The great political events of the late 18th century, the American and French revolutions, specifically eschewed the role of religion in politics. The idea of separation of church and state grew into an essential feature of modern society. This continued right through the 19th and 20th centuries. Anti-clerical wars were fought in Mexico. Britain politically emancipated Catholics and Jews in the 1850s. France, by law, separated church and state in 1905. The Russian Revolution ended the political power of the Orthodox Church. Confucianism faded in China. In the Middle East, too, Islamic politics declined as the Ottoman Empire collapsed, and secularists like Ataturk in Turkey and the Pahlavi Shahs of India took political control. The divorcement of religion and politics and its reduction in the public agenda seemed to be a policy all over. For most of the 20th century, religion did not play a major role in politics and world affairs. The Russian and Chinese revolutions, First World War, Second World War, the anti-colonial revolution, had little religious input. In societies, Western and Eastern, religion more and more became a matter of personal belief and did not have much of a political agenda. Some religious figures like Gandhi and Martin Luther King had great political impacts, but the political agenda was essentially secular. Even the terrorist movements of that time, 50s, 60s, and 70s, were largely ideological secular movements. Okay? A new world arose, the non-Western world, what we call the Third World. Its leaders in the post-colonial world were very indifferent to religion in politics. Nehru in India, Sukarno in Indonesia, Nasser in the Middle East had little regard for religious politics. Okay? The Zionists, especially Ben-Gurion and others like Golda Meir, were very much against religious involvement in politics. In fact, at the beginning of Israel, Ben-Gurion said that the ultras, the ultra-Orthodox, would decline and eventually disappear. So therefore, any concessions you gave them would be very temporary. Little did he know. As a young student, I once asked Abba Iban about religion as a political force in the Middle East. And he said, "You're wasting your time. That's for historians and theologians. That's not for the study of politics today." So those of us who studied politics did not pay much attention to religion as a political force. There was some religious input into peace movements, into anti-racism, into ban the bomb. But by and large, religion was not a major ingredient in a world where political affairs were increasingly secular. I made this long excursion into history to demonstrate to you how religion as a political activity, the religious agenda, diminished and became a historical dinosaur in our time. Okay? In this country, okay, both liberals and conservatives were not very concerned about religious issues in politics. Conservatives like Robert Taft and Arthur Vandenberg, other Republicans like Tom Dewey, Wendell Willkie, had no use for religion in politics. The dominant figure of that time, FDR, was very much against a religious intrusion into politics. As late as the 1960s, Barry Goldwater, the arch-conservative, said this. He said, "Religion in public life is crap." That's a quotation from him. Okay? It looked as if all over the world, the essential parts of modern progress were secularization in politics. Okay? Then, something amazing took place. Okay? In a scientific, largely secular world, where religious politics seemed to be dead, a sudden revival took place about 35 years ago. Two men particularly inspired this. The Ayatollah took control of Iran in 1979. He advanced three ideas that have somehow become very powerful notions in the Middle East since then. The revival of religious activism, particularly Shia Islam, the concept of theocracy, ruled by religious leaders and religious laws, and the jihadist approach to internationalizing these ideas. Okay. Increasingly, these notions have gathered great strength in the Islamic world and in the Middle East and outside. Okay. And springing from them, political parties like Hamas and Hezbollah, the Sadrists, the Muslim Brotherhood, have proliferated and prospered. Okay. And taking it a step further, you saw the coming of the religious warrior and the religiously inspired terrorist, the most extreme form of action, which has now become endemic in the Islamic world. Young men and many young women too, educated, some doing fairly well economically, join these forces. And holy killing, always a feature of religious extremism, has become sanctified. Okay. The other figure who encouraged a political agenda sourced in religion was the old Pope, John Paul II, who also became a Pope in 1979, was there for 27 years, and promoted religion as an anti-communist force in Eastern Europe, but also went beyond that and felt that religion should have a political input in most societies. In the past 30 years, these concepts have advanced all over. In Israel, the ultra-Orthodox, once a rather quiet and introverted group, counting for about 10 to 15% of the population, have become exceptionally assertive, politically motivated, and sometimes violent. In this country, we have seen the rise of the religious right and its political children who are so influential in trying to control our public agenda. In India, you've seen the advance of Hindu nationalism and their doctrine of what is called Hindutva, a Hindu society. It's begun to shape a country that was once rather proud of its secular politics. In fact, last year, the Hindu nationalists won a huge victory in their national election. Okay. In Indonesia, not a very violent society recently, Islamic terrorists have begun blowing up Christian villages. Okay. In Japan, a nationalism associated with some forms of religion has risen. In the Buddhist world, Buddhism is a religion of peace and tolerance. You've seen Buddhists attacking Islamics in Burma, Myanmar, Buddhist priests trying to control the political agenda in Sri Lanka, militant Buddhists active in Thailand, and even the Dalai Lama, the symbol of nonviolent Buddhist practice, is having some difficulty trying to control younger Tibetans who want more violent political action in their struggle against China. Okay. Now, this has gone beyond that. In Russia, the Orthodox Church was practically dead under communism. But Putin has made a pact with the revived Orthodox Church. And so, on the political agenda comes things that are inspired by the Orthodox Church, like homophobic policies. Okay. In southern Russia, the Chechens, inspired by Islamic militancy, lead local wars. In Europe, various forms of extremism, not too much driven by religion, but by social anger, increasingly promotes both anti-Islamic and anti-Jewish activities, actions sometimes reminiscent of the old anti-Semitism. In parts of Africa and the Middle East today, religious extremism has taken two forms. One, it influences conventional politics. You've seen the rise of Islamic parties. But then it has also promoted barbaric political movements. I don't need to tell you too much about Al-Qaeda and ISIS, and some of you know about Boko Haram, the Nigerian Islamic group that captured those 200 girls last April. We still don't know where they are. Okay. It now dominates a large part of northern Nigeria. It's spreading to neighboring countries like Mali and Chad. Okay. And if at some time in the future it is able to spread to southern Nigeria, it will capture the important oil fields of that region. Okay. All this is just a sampling of the proliferation of religious political extremism in our time. Religious political extremism is now a major defining force in our world, and so surprising that it has come back in the past 30, 40 years. It draws its strength not only from belief, but it is also well financed. In some cases, it has control of oil wells, like ISIS has in some areas, from ransoms, from payoffs. Okay. It is like a specter from the past. Religious extremism now rises from the grave to torment us. Now, let me take a kind of academic approach to this topic and present you with 4 questions, which, like a good academic, I will answer myself. Okay. 4 very basic questions that perhaps will give us some insight into what is happening in the field of religious extremism and its political agenda today. The first question is this: how serious is this? In the past century, we've seen awful forces blend into politics. Ideologies like Marxism, communism, okay, racism, okay, anti-Semitism, militarism. Some have been defeated, some decline, some linger on. In recent times, the intrusion of religion into public affairs is probably the single most dangerous development in this area. Religions in politics almost always embrace a very hard agenda. They want to impose its rules on everyone, whether you like it or not, and it is not too easy to defeat. It is dangerous in democratic countries because it erodes the separation of church and state. It promotes laws, rules, regulations that should be made because God wants them to be made. The democratic choice is not necessary. Okay? God's wishes, as religious politicians interpret them, are much more important than what people want. Secular laws are less valid than God's laws. Religious politics almost always tends towards authoritarianism and attacks the great treasure of democracy, which is pluralism. There is no role for compromise in the religious political agenda. Okay. In this country, religious-based influence in politics is growing. We know that very well. A whole political theology has arisen. Okay. They look at government as a way of enforcing their beliefs, and the way in which personal and private issues have recently become public issues in this country is truly staggering. It started with school prayer, now it goes to abortion, birth control, stem cell research, same-sex marriage, discussion of evolution, and so many other things. In each of them, the state is asked to mandate or restrict choice for individuals. And there are politicians who openly and actively advocate this. I'll give you a few examples. The longtime governor of Texas, who wanted to run for president last time and might well do so in 2016, has just said this. Regarding the problems confronting America, he said, Rick Perry that is, it is time for us to just hand it all over to God and to say, God, you're going to fix America. Okay. There's another potential Republican candidate called Mike Huckabee from Arkansas, who has said over and over again that this is a God-centered nation, and we must understand that our laws do not come from man, they come from God. Okay. Huckabee is a rather extreme case, but the Republican courtship of the religious right and its fear of giving offense to Christian fundamentalists has been a feature of recent politics. Okay. Listen to what is happening in Alabama right now, okay, where the opponents of gay marriage are asserting that it runs counter to all religious norms. Okay. And you've seen the Chief Justice of Alabama saying that secular laws don't really matter in today's world. In non-democratic countries, the growth of religious political extremism has been even more dangerous. It encourages governments to support, even to set up violent groups, because they claim to be promoting religion. Thus, the rise of religious terrorism. Today, most terrorism has some religious component. Religious policies and politics inspire governments and groups to go outside their countries, attacking God's enemies as they define them. These are the new wars of today. It is not country against country. National borders are not important. It's a war of beliefs, and the whole world is their battlefield. A sidebar about Islam in this political context. For the first time in history, we now find large numbers of Islamic people who do not live under Islamic rule but live in the West. Okay. Now, some extremists in the Islamic world believe that they must attack these societies for seducing Islamic believers. You've seen that in Paris. You've seen that in Denmark. Okay. Another concern of religion in politics is this. It is the role of rationality in political decision making. Religions advocate a process of decision making that is very dangerous because often it is not rational. For example, no secular government will rationally contemplate a nuclear war. But a religious state may well believe that it is God's will to totally destroy its enemies, and therefore nuclear destruction. Religion will not necessarily be an obstacle to nuclear war. In foreign affairs, in foreign policy, religious politics is particularly troubling. The essence of foreign policy is compromise in today's world. This is very necessary. In today's world, no nation can get everything it wants. We see that in the Ukraine. We can't get what we want, neither can Putin. Total victories are almost impossible. But when you act from religious impulses, negotiations, compromise are very difficult. If you're acting for God, God is right and all others have to be wrong. How do you negotiate? Okay. On balance, I think we can say that the increase of religion as a political instrument has made this a much more dangerous world, and those dangers are increasing. One of the problems is it is very difficult to oppose this, because who wants to be seen as being against religion? Okay? And you have to define what type of religion you're against. It's very difficult to oppose religion in whatever form, because it looks as if you're anti-religion, anti-beliefs of people. My second question is this: how does religious politics express itself, manifest itself? Okay? This is a rather complex thing, because if you are a religious extremist in your own home or in your private life, that's your right. Okay? If you take it a little further and you want to impact on public life, you want to make laws, you want to regulate society because of your religious beliefs, you want to impose certain ideas on others. If you do this peacefully, within the normal laws of a country, that is also your right. But when you want to compel others and resort to force, then it becomes a public danger. I think the red line is compulsion. Okay. Take that danger further, and it often ends in political violence. Okay. Religiously inspired, political-oriented violence is a terrible thing, because those who carry out political violence in the name of religion are absolutely convinced that they're doing nothing wrong. It's okay to do anything: terror, torture, rape, murder. There are no limits to which religious-inspired violence will not go. We see that so clearly in the Middle East among religious terrorist groups. ISIS is the best example. They don't think they're doing anything wrong. There are no limits. Beheading people, torturing people, if it's done in the name of God, they believe, is perfectly okay. This is the nexus between terrorism and religious extremism. In 1968, many studies that were done showed that none of the top terrorist groups were motivated by religion. Today, almost all the top terrorist groups have some religious connection, and the religious terrorism proliferates. Okay? Even more scary is that we are now seeing the rise of the individual terrorist, a kind of terrorist entrepreneur, a man and sometimes now a woman who acts by themselves out of some religious impulse. They belong to no group. They act out of religious belief. They're difficult to track, difficult to apprehend. Some believe that suicide terrorism is a holy act. Okay? The unaffiliated terrorist is becoming the icon of our times. And we see this happening particularly in the Middle East and now increasingly in Europe. All this is growing today. Much of it comes from the perversion of Islam, but other religious convictions also embrace this. For example, there is the Lord's Resistance Army, some sort of Christian aberration in southern Sudan, Uganda, and northern Congo, For over 20 years, they have inducted children, about 30,000 kids, and turned them into killing terrorists. They're led by a man called Joseph Kony. There is a $5 million bounty on his head. African Union troops are trying to catch him. We are trying to apprehend him. He's still active. And some of those children become self-guided individual terrorists. Okay? Many of these religiously inspired political groups function as political parties in the Middle East. Hamas rules Gaza. Hezbollah is part of the Lebanese political establishment. The theocrats have ruled Iran for 36 years. The Muslim Brotherhood governed Egypt for a year or two until ejected by the military. They were democratically elected. Okay. This is the dilemma. When religiously inspired political groups are democratically elected, how do we react? Are they entitled to impose their ideas because they have been democratically endorsed? Okay. This is a great issue in modern politics. Do you accept electoral results even if they are motivated by the worst impulses? In Turkey right now, a political party, the Justice and Development Party, the AKP, has governed that country since 2002. It's won 3 fair elections. Now they are moving increasingly to impose religious laws and becoming more and more authoritarian. How does one respond to this? Does a society have the right to govern itself in the way it wants to? May well be so long as they don't cross international borders. But it is a very troubling issue. My third question concerns why this is happening today. Is there some reason for the recent expansion of religious political activity? I am not very sure of why this has happened in the Western world. Why the frustration of young people, many who are educated, many who are doing economically very well, okay, not very poor, okay, have moved them to religious extremism and taken them in to religious political action. Is it that they feel alienated and powerless in modern technological society? Is it due to large immigration and their resentment at this and what it brings and what it provokes? Is it anger against a society where so much economic growth is lodged in the 1%? Is it driven by a hyper-hysterical media? And why does it become popular in Western nations? I'm much puzzled by this. I'm a little more certain of the sources of religious extremism in the non-Western world, especially in the Islamic Middle East. The Islamic Middle East has a startling demographic. 60% of the population in those areas is below 30 years of age. 60% is below 30 years of age. Many are unemployed, but they have some education and very little hope for the future. Despair often opens the gates of religious extremism, and the explosion of the social media links them together. In the past generation or so, almost every type of government in the Middle East has failed to provide a better life. Okay. Failed to provide a better society. Socialism has failed. Militarism has failed. Monarchies have failed. Civil authoritarianism has failed. Communism and democracy don't have much traction in those societies. Okay. At the same time, the traditional ways of protest, revolutions, public demonstrations, okay, boycotts, strikes, political resistance, hasn't gotten them anywhere. Perhaps this is what drives so many younger people to do something outside conventional politics. Try to find some new way. And Islamists are always ready with a very powerful slogan, Islam is the answer. Okay. Perhaps the hopelessness of secular life, the absence of future, leads to a form of desperation that is so difficult for us to understand. Okay. Most of those hijackers of 9/11 were Saudi young people who did not come from a deprived background, okay, and yet were motivated to kill not only themselves but thousands of others. Okay. Do they seek some glory in martyrdom, especially if you can go out with a big bang? Okay. Is there nothing in life, perhaps some for them in the future? Is that the attraction to religious politics? You will surely go to heaven or some glorious place if you die for your religion. And there is the ultimate insurance. Whatever you do for religion is okay because it's done for God. So in many parts of the world, religious politics provides an outlet and a form of expression that they cannot get elsewhere. Is that likely to lessen in the future? It depends on the shape of those political societies. Okay. So my fourth question is this. Where is all of this going? How can we deal with this? Okay. Are we doomed to have religious-based policies thrust down our throat at home and religiously based violence attacking us from inside and outside? Will we ever be able to recover the atmosphere of cooperation and compromise or moderation that enables governments to function effectively? Okay. There is some hope in history. Let me give you 3 messages from history. History shows us that this kind of religious political spasm comes from time to time. It's happened before. It makes trouble, but then inevitably it recedes. Let me give you a few examples. In the 1480s in southern Europe, Spain, Portugal, southern France, an Ayatollah arose whose actions were just as brutal as ISIS today. His name was Thomas Torquemada of the Inquisition. He burnt people, tortured them, laid down rules for public behavior, frightened governments, and were extremely powerful, brutal, and by their standards successful for a time. After some years, the average person in society who welcomed the arrival of the Inquisition got so fed up that the authorities shut down the Inquisition. The religious politician Savonarola was another such figure in Florence in 1490s. Savonarola was also very much like an Ayatollah. He demanded extreme religious zealousness. Secularism was out. People were burnt at the stake. Okay. All sorts of rules and regulations were instituted, all of them lodged in religion. He was cheered when he proposed this, and after a few years, the very people who cheered him killed him. He had asked too much. You saw this in Calvin's Geneva. In the mid-1500s, John Calvin got control of Geneva and again instituted all sorts of rigidities. People were burnt, books were banned, religious rules were adopted, and after 10 years, people arose against him and got rid of him. An Islamic leader called the Mahdi arose in the Sudan, got power in the 1880s, was a political saint for several years, and eventually, when he died, he was completely discredited. So too, in its own way, was what happened in this country in the 1930s. This was a terrible period in American history, the Depression, looked as if there was no way out. And many Ayatollahs arose around this country. Religious preachers who had a political agenda. You might remember some of their names, Billy Sunday, Amy McPherson Semple, Father Divine, Father Coughlin. They all had various notions of how the country should be run. and they looked quite dangerous. Well, after some time, the depression eased, the war came, they faded away. It seems that this kind of religious political extremism contains the seeds of its own destruction. We see this right now going on with ISIS. Okay? ISIS has been, by their standards, fairly successful. People from all over the world, maybe 10,000, have gone to support ISIS. Some from here, they say about 300-400, about 1,000, 2,000 from Europe. Okay? Young people gone to fight for ISIS. Some of them have got disillusioned and want to leave. They are beheaded. Okay? We focus on the beheading of few Americans and Europeans, but beheading is a very common action in the ISIS areas. It is things like that that will turn people against ISIS. You've seen the impact of this on Jordan. Jordan was sort of fairly favorable to ISIS. But the burning alive of that Jordanian pilot has turned Jordan very much into an anti-ISIS land. The type of brutality that these people impose on societies inevitably turn societies against them. But on the way, it's a terrible experience. Okay? And right now it seems to me that we are the midpoint of this kind of development. You see the reaction against it in Iran, where the reformers and the moderates are blocked in some kind of contest in recent years. Okay? So that's the first lesson from history, that we should not, in the long run, despair, but in the short run, these political extremists are going to create a lot of problems. Okay? A second lesson from history is this: outsiders cannot control these things. The reaction has to come from inside. We can't launch a global war on terrorism and expect it to be successful. If local people are against it, we should help them. But trying to do the heavy lifting ourselves inevitably gets us into a huge, big confrontation with Islam and with other religions. Okay? We learned this surely, or we didn't learn it from our Afghan experience. Okay? We encouraged counter-extremism in Afghanistan. We armed the Taliban and others. We gave them liberal assistance. They defeated, we armed those against the Taliban. They defeated the Taliban and those around them there. They pushed Al-Qaeda out of Afghanistan, and then they turned on us. Okay? Arming extremists to fight extremists is a very dangerous thing to which we seem to be somewhat prone. Okay? So the second lesson is this, that despite the inclination, and there is a strong war party who wants to fight a global war on terrorism, it is very unlikely to be successful and just will get us into more difficulties. Okay? That doesn't mean we should not help those who are against this. Okay? A third lesson comes from this, and that is probably the most controversial. I think we should stay as far away from these areas, particularly in the Middle East, okay, and protect ourselves at home, subject to two things: the security of Israel and the export of terrorism here. We are in no condition today to get involved in struggles in many of those countries. We have no interest in it today. Our oil situation is much improved. So I think some prudence is probably better than a drum-beating aggression. Now, it seems to me that as these movements come and go, and I think it's beginning to happen, it'll create lots of enthusiasm for fighting it. If any fight has to be done, it has to be done at home. Okay? And here, of course, comes our own situation. It's a different type of political religious extremism, but it is a branch of that same genre. America is quite notable in the 20th century for its absence of religious violence. We've had various other violences, but religious violence, there hasn't been too much of it here. If our religiously minded political enthusiasts get more and more active, it will inevitably lead to some kind of religious violence. We have in this country opportunity to control this trend. It's called elections. If secular-minded people who are still in a majority do not vote, if they remain apathetic, religious political activists will grow, at least for a time. And so in many ways, the answer is up to us. There is a larger global dimension to this. As the 20th century unfolds, a great three-cornered contest for international leadership and power is taking place. In one corner is America and other democracies, perhaps Western Europe, Japan, so on. Okay. In another corner is Russia and China, a new model of political authoritarianism based on capitalism. Okay. A third contender for world leadership is the theocratic model of governance, especially the Islamic states. What distinguishes us from the others is our pluralism. The belief that you can have different choices, that we separate church from state. If we lose a good part of that, if we lose a good part of the thing which gives us the freedom that religious extremists want to extinguish, we'll be not very different from theocratical societies. Okay? This is a very important thing to remember right now. In the 2012 election, religion played a significant part. Okay? Will it do so in the 2016 election? I hope not, but I think so. Okay? It is perhaps one of the great dangers to American society, political society today. It is very important that we realize that the political religious extremism in other countries has a resonance of its own, but that we are also not exempt from some form of that activity. This is why I think that we should pay a great deal of attention to the religious political agenda of people in this society and keep it in the forefront of our minds as we look to our society. Around the world, we have to watch these trends to see that while they may endanger others, they do not endanger us or indeed our allies in the Middle East like Israel. Beyond that, we have to understand the message of history that certain ideas and ideologies contain the seeds of their own destruction, and those who try to get too much involved in them often burn themselves. Today, this country is not able to carry out a global war against anyone. Our resources are less. Our allies are of a different caliber. There are two kinds of wars: wars of necessity, those which you have to fight; wars of choice, which you choose to fight. We have gotten too many wars of choice, and we should be very careful about getting into wars of choice which drag us into religious wars, of which we are all very scared. Thank you very much. Okay. Now, this is an enormous topic, one with a great deal of historical background to it. I tried to confine my observations to a few key essentials so that we can discuss this before you are brave enough to go home. Okay. If you have any questions or thoughts. Yeah. Yes, yes, sir.
There's been a lot of discussion about the need for Islam to have its own
Yeah,
and we should stay away.
yeah.
Do you think that's a solution, and how likely is that to happen?
Is Islam going to have its own reformation? Should we stay away from that? The answer to both is, I think so. Okay. There are signs now that some people in Islam are beginning to reconsider this. Okay. Not as many as we would like. These resistances come slowly. But the more you get groups like ISIS governing areas, the more people get repugnant. It's something that we cannot hasten. It's something that we should also not get too involved in. If there are those who resist, we should help them, but it's not our battle. I don't like saying this. I would also like to get involved in something that resists this thing, but I don't think we are in a position to do this. Sometimes the more active you are, the more it works against you. So, an Islamic reformation is slow in coming. There are some signs. I think before that happens, there will have to be many more changes in the Middle East. The Middle East is going through 3 big convulsions today. A political collapse, okay? An economic collapse driven by the decline in the price of oil. Oil was the mother's milk of that area. But you know, oil also supported various religious activities, so you're drying up the swamp, and the growth of religious wars. Those have to work themselves out. And I think out of that, it's quite possible that you will get some counter move. You know, it happened in the Middle East. That was what Ataturk in Turkey was about. That's what the Shah of Iran was about. In fact, that's what Nasser was about. We didn't like Nasser, but that's what he was about. Okay? That's what Sadat was about. To some extent, that's what Mubarak was about. Some of the misgovernments of those secularists or neo-secularists led to a big reaction. Okay? And as I told you, when you get 60% of the people without any opportunity and ruled by these kind of dictators, however secular they are, there is a reaction. That reaction has to burn itself out. And I think that will happen. Okay? Yeah. Yes, sir. I'm sorry. Again, I'm sorry. Should we get involved with Iran's production of a nuclear weapon? We are involved with Iran's production of a nuclear weapon, against it, okay? We should do, I think, everything that we are doing now to try and have some agreement to negotiate this. The experts say that if everything goes smoothly and they really want to push it, they're about a year away from getting a nuclear weapon, okay? Now, there are 2 or 3 things to remember here. Nobody mentions very much something else. There is a huge clandestine program by Israel, by the United States and Israel together, to sabotage this. Occasionally, Iranian scientists disappear. Nobody knows what happens to them. A fire takes place in some laboratory. A Stuxnet takes place, okay? I think it'll be, in the long run, very difficult for them to get a nuclear weapon because of all this activity. Now talks are going on. I don't know whether they'll succeed or not. We have got a standstill. That is, they're not producing anything, doing anymore. We can verify that now. Will we get something? I don't know. If we don't get something, it's a big question to us. Okay? Should we tighten sanctions? Yes. Should we go to war? I don't know whether that will work. Okay? And this is, of course, the big controversy that involves Prime Minister Netanyahu, okay? And is bedeviling Israeli-American relations at the present time. Okay? So that's another part of it. I think that launching military attacks on Middle Eastern societies is a fruitless endeavor. Okay? I don't know. Let's look at it like this. We couldn't prevent North Korea from getting a nuclear weapon. We couldn't prevent Pakistan from getting a nuclear weapon. Okay? Now we are trying in various ways to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. Instead of focusing on these specific societies, I think we should be investing a lot of our diplomatic energy in putting together an international anti-nuclear proliferation NATO to get big countries of the world together. The Russians are very much against nuclear proliferation. They are very scared that the Chechen rebels will get a nuclear weapon, and they were driven by Islam. They will blow them all up. Okay, the Chinese are very worried that Islamic tribes on their borderland in Central Asia will get nuclear weapons someday. Okay, so if we can get some group together, powerful nations, who will say to the rest of the world, look, we tried to stop you from getting nuclear weapons, we have failed. But if there's any evidence that you're trying to use it, and nuclear weapons have an easily traceable signature, all of us will join together and jump on you. That is the NATO principle. Okay? I think we should invest much more diplomatic effort in that, but that means we have to improve our relationship with Russia. Okay? So that's my long answer to your very good question. Yes, sir. In Iran. How strong is the reformer movement in Iran? If you look at it in the context of modern Iranian politics, it's quite amazing. That is, the theocrats have ruled for 36 years. Okay? And there was no chance that anyone would contest them. Now, slowly that contest has come to the extent where the reformers were able to elect a president. Okay? And now it is a struggle in Iran between those who want to amend things and those who want to perpetuate the theocracy. Okay? So that way I think it has come quite far. Okay? Can the reformers be crushed? The theocrats have tried to crush them in many ways. Okay? Fixing elections, trying to lock them up, they haven't succeeded. Okay? So I think there's some hope there. It will take some time. The average Iranian is a fairly modern person, okay? Exposed to international interaction in the past. I find it difficult to believe that they will want the perpetuation of a theocratic regime, especially as the theocratic regime is becoming corrupt the longer it is there. Theocrats are very popular at the start. Oh, reformers, they look honest, they look inspired. Once they are there for some time, the corruption of power begins to turn people against them. So I think in Iran, something's happening. We are adding to it by sanctions right now. Okay? But that also we have to be rather careful how we increase the sanctions or not. Okay? And I don't think that attacking Iran will help the reformers in any way. Okay? Yeah. Yes, sir.
Just following up on the last question.
Yeah.
Do you see an increasing role for women?
In Iran? In Iran?
In Middle East politics?
Yes. This is one of the hopes that I have. I think that as women get more involved, policies will begin to change. Okay? Now, you say, okay, but doesn't seem like much is happening. It is beginning to happen slowly. Okay? The Saudi regime is having a lot of problem now in trying to prevent women from driving, okay, from going abroad unless accompanied by some relative. The Shador, the Hajib, that's not really so important as the ability of women to go out on their own, okay, get higher education. I think that is slowly beginning to happen. Okay. You remember Golda Meir, when she was asked when the wars will stop, said that when people in those societies love their children more than they hate us, then it will stop. And that is why I think that the advance of women is... Now, this has two parts to it. Advance of women, we may like to see, but there's also another form of advancement of women, getting involved in fighting, getting involved in terrorism. That's also, in a way, a sort of liberation of women, okay? Doing things that they didn't do before. Okay, how far that will go, I don't know. But some of these more modern times, Islamic women have become terrorists, okay? In fact, one of the big things in today's world is the involvement of women in conflict. Through most of history, 50% of the world's population was not involved in conflict. Conflict was a man's activity, okay? Today, all over the world, women, American military has 15% of women. They will be soon in combat brigades. The Israeli Defense Force has almost 40% of its, I can't say manpower, its force are women, okay? All over the world, women are getting involved in what is essentially a man's activity. Will that add ferocity to it? Will it change it? I don't know. This is a very recent development and a tremendous change from history. 50% of the world's population essentially were not involved in conflict. Now they are being embraced into conflict, okay? Maybe it will have a good effect, okay? Yes?
How stable do you see the Saudi Arabian government over the next few years, and if it weakens, what forces do you see
Yeah.
coming to the forefront?
How stable is the Saudi Arabian government and what forces could take over? Many people tell us that, oh, it's fairly stable now. They handle the succession of the last king to the new king fairly well and all that. I don't believe that. I think that any society which is modernizing but has an obsolete monarchy, 5,000 princes living on the public payroll, government largely in the hands of the royal family, okay? No political parties, no trade unions, okay? Alliances with religion but little public participation is not a regime that will last very long in the modern world. You will note that the unrest in the Middle East started in North Africa and it is moving eastward. It moved to Egypt, it moved to Syria, to Iraq, to Lebanon, now to Yemen. It's moving closer to the Persian Gulf, where these old monarchs have managed to survive in various ways. Also, have managed to survive because they bribed their populations with goodies from oil money. Now, oil prices have fallen. Saudis, to some extent, are behind it. Saudis have a big cushion, but all those other monarchies, okay, Kuwait, Oman, United Arab Emirates, will be in difficulty. And I think the longevity of the Saudi monarchical system is something I wouldn't bet on. So then what will take its place? That is the big question, okay? Actually, in that area, the big struggle today, local struggle, is between Iran and Saudi Arabia for the leadership of the Middle East. Right? There are a group of Shias, maybe 5-10% in Saudi Arabia, who the Saudis think are being set up by the Iranians to create problems for the regime. All these make the Saudi regime, in my mind, very fragile. What will succeed? I don't know. That is the day when nobody will want to be President of the United States. Because the President of the United States will have to decide whether to send American troops and safeguard the Saudi oil fields, or to walk away from Saudi Arabia, as we did with Mubarak, and let the jihadists take over, perhaps. What would you do in such a situation? Okay?
The revolts have been driven by popular discontent, and yet it's the extremists that seem to are able to consolidate power. Why is that happening?
The revolts in the Middle East have been driven by popular feeling, but the extremists have got control of it for one very simple reason. The Arab Spring 2011 showed us that there's a lot of moderate democratic feeling, even among young people. But you know, they were not organized, they were not rather diffused. They were a sort of a larger version of Occupy Wall Street. Okay? Then came the two most organized groups in the Middle East who shoved them aside, the military and the religious groups. Organization triumphed over public feeling. Okay? Will organization triumph over public feeling in the long term? I don't know. Okay? Some of those young people have been there, I've spoken to them, have joined the either side, military or the extremists. But many are just waiting for another opportunity. And they are the children of the new era of the social media, the mobile telephone, the internet. Okay? That is a latent force which someday I think will reassert itself. In politics, as we know here, organization counts. They were not very well organized. Okay? So that's what happened. Now these two groups, extremists and the military, are fighting themselves off back and forth. How long it will go, I don't know. Who will triumph, I don't know. But at some point, I think, all those millions of people who wanted some kind of more freedom, more democratic expression, will reassert themselves, I think. Okay? The question is, when, at what time? I am not, as many people are, I am not totally pessimistic on the Middle East. I'm sort of short-term pessimistic, but long-term optimistic. Okay? Because I think those forces are still there. Okay? Yes, sir.
Without the burnout occurring here in this country due to extremism,
Yeah.
where do you see American religious extremism in politics going over the next 10 years?
I don't know where American political extremism will go. I was very scared during the second George Bush administration because he was going along those lines. Okay, I think that by and large the American electorate is a fairly secular electorate, and if this goes a little too far, they will react against it. But again, organization counts, money counts. There is a third political party that has arisen in this country right today. That is the Koch brothers and Sheldon Adelson. Okay, it's a third political party actually. Okay, it is better financed than many of the old political parties. Okay, how far that will go? What is their agenda? Okay, I think that basically over a long period of time, the American public will tolerate this, but at some point will resist it. Okay, now. That doesn't mean that people cannot express themselves, the religious ideas, but to impose it on society, I'm surprised that it has gone so far as it has today. Okay? And that is largely because secular moderates in the society don't vote. Okay? Yes, sir. Yes, there's short-term pessimism, long-term optimism extend to Russia. Yes. You know, if you look at Russia, these are well-educated people. They're modern people, okay? But they're being governed by the Tsarist system. You talk about the brevity of the Saudi system. Putin is a Tsar, okay? He is far more effective, I think, than the Saudi family in holding power, okay? He's in his own way, he's capable of managing power. But if suddenly something happens to Putin, if he breaks a leg or worse, okay, the system can't be held. Okay? It's like the Castros. Only the Castros can run the Cuban system. As they grow old and they are fading, the system is going. Putin has been around for 15 years now. Okay, one of these days, some of his enemies will do something to him, or eventually he will fade away. Russia, to me, is very strange because by nature of its people, its education, its society, it should be like a Western European country. But its politics has always been medieval. Now, at some time, that tension is going. That tension led to the collapse of communism. Then Putin, the latest Tsar, got hold of Russia. Well, you know, Tsarism had a history which ended in tragedy. It may happen there. I think that Russia will not be an automatic stooge of the West, or Russia is an independent country with a great history that should be having its own destiny. Whether that destiny is to be managed by someone like Putin for a long term, I doubt. You see, Putin is essentially a czar. He's got the Russian Orthodox Church. He's beating up nationalism. He's got these ideas of czarist boundaries. Okay, he's very much a czar. No. To China is a very different situation. And China, see, I don't want to give you a long lecture, but very briefly it's this. China has a population of 1.3 billion, okay? It has a communist party of about 85, 90 million people, okay? They are all participating in this, and they are supporters of the regime. Putin doesn't have anything like that, okay? And there's something else. Under post-Mao capitalism, the average Chinese has benefited, okay, as never before. Therefore, I think there's a lot of reserve support for the regime. Now, the new anti-corruption program of the Chinese leader. To some of us, it looks as if only his enemies are anti-corrupt. But it is having an impact on society. It is very popular among people. Putin doesn't have an anti-corruption program. There'll be nobody left to run Russia. Okay. So there is a lot more resonance in China, I feel. Also, you must remember that in their own way, the Chinese have done something quite remarkable for an authoritarian state. They have instituted term limits for their leaders. They were so fed up with Mao's lifelong tenure, Deng Xiaoping's 27 years. Now the Chinese leadership changes every 5-10 years to 5-year terms, and they're out. Last two Chinese leaders didn't want to go, but they went out. So they renewed it. So that, I think, is also a safety valve. Okay, and there's also something else. If you look at the world in 1500, the big shots in the world, Europe was nothing, small corner of the world, not very important. America wasn't discovered. The big shots were China, Islamic empires, and pre-Columbian Latin America. Okay. Now they were all pushed aside by the Atlantic powers. First Europe, then later the United States. Now they have the opportunity to come back. In Latin America is a different situation, but the Islamic resurgence, the Chinese resurgence, in a sense reflects their own idea of coming back to what they think they should be in the world. Right? China particularly. Right? So, since the Chinese regime has increased the power ranking of China from nothing to number 2 in a short period of time, that is also a source of a lot of pride and support among the people. I was there around the time of the Olympics. The pride that those people felt that their country could turn out in Olympics was a great source of support to the regime. Okay, so I think that it has a much longer, greater longevity than the Russian system. Okay, yeah. Yes. Do I see a change in Egyptian politics as a result of Putin's visit? Yes. The military pushed out the Muslim Brotherhood. Now there are many who are rather happy about that. But that is the dilemma. The Muslim Brotherhood was democratically elected. Okay, so what do you do? Anyway, they've got control. Thousands have been killed as a result. Okay, we were a little uneasy with the military regime, but we are sort of coming to terms with it. Israel gets on well with the military regime. Putin sees the opportunity and has been of great assistance to Egypt. Okay, and he is driven by something else. The more friends he can make in the Islamic world, the better for his position in Chechnya. Right? But he's quoting Egypt, and he has been fairly successful. So I think that will go on for some time. I don't know how far the Islamists in Egypt will be able to upset the military regime. There is one big battle coming which you must remember. It's going to take place in the Sinai. The Sinai is a large patch of sand between Israel and Egypt, about half the size of New York State, very thinly populated, 1.5 million tribal peoples. As the military has smashed the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, many of the Brotherhood have gone into the Sinai and have started a revolt against Egypt from the Sinai. The Egyptian army is battling the Brotherhood and its allies in the Sinai in a fairly big way. Israel is helping them to do that. Okay, Russians are helping them. So the military is fairly close to Russia and probably will survive for some time. Okay, as a result of this. Okay, Russia is, since we have and Western Europe have kind of blocked Russia and sanctioned, Russia has now begun courting Egypt, Turkey, okay, re-establishing itself in India, that connecting to China. Okay, I think that our policies to Russia may result in driving Putin into the arms of the Chinese. Okay, so the answer to your question, yes, the nexus between Putin and Egypt is growing. And you must remember this. The Russians were running Egypt under Nasser for a long time. Then Sadat came and switched to the West. Then Mubarak came and balanced both. So the Russians already have some sort of bases of contact and things there. Okay? Yeah. Okay. Yes, sir. Yeah. Yeah. A news item that Putin may have problem. The Chinese will bail him out. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Do I feel Obama is pandering to the Muslims? It's a very interesting question. Netanyahu thinks so. Okay. Obama's answer is this. Netanyahu feels that clearly that Obama is reaching out too much to the Islamic people. Okay? Obama's answer is this. It is my job as President of the United States to reach out to everybody. If you're in Israel, you can take a different attitude, but it is my job to reach out to everybody. Some people think he's gone a little too far. But the fact is this, that under Obama, and Israeli leaders all say this, Israel has got a tremendous amount of help from the United States. Okay? We paid for Iron Dome financing, opened our weapons depositories there to Israeli. There have been a lot of contacts. Somehow the political relationship hasn't worked very much, and many people say Obama is leaning a little too much towards the Islamic group and so on. Obama and Kerry seem to feel that they must somehow bring Islamists into world affairs and closer contact. Otherwise, things will get out of hand in the Middle East. I am not overly fond of that strategy, but I can understand what they're trying to do. Okay, so that is. Is it the job of the President of the United States to reach out to everybody, or to restrict his contacts with others and stick only with close and tried friends? That's basically this situation. Obama will say absolutely not. Netanyahu says, yes, it is so. Many in Israel also, this has become an election issue in Israel, Obama, Netanyahu's attitude. So I suppose if I were President of the United States, I would also try to reach out to Islamic world to see what I can get. He hasn't been very successful, I must say that. Okay, but should he make the effort? Well, perhaps. Yeah. Okay. Yes. Shh. Yes, madam. Yes. Yes, madam. Yeah. What about Netanyahu coming to speak here? How does it? Israeli elections, Netanyahu's visit here. I think it's a very bad idea for Israel to get involved in domestic American politics. Okay? That it should be bipartisan, which it always has been, to pick one side and use the platform of the American Congress to attack American government policies with Iran is, I think, unnecessary involvement in American politics, okay? And it's also a big issue in Israel. Okay? Many opposition saying he shouldn't do that and so on. To negotiate with the Speaker of the House of Representatives in secret without informing the government, without doing anything, and suddenly spring it, also is a little too partisan, locking himself into secret arrangements, invitations and all that, I think. So I think that's a dangerous thing to do, to be rather partisan. Second part of your question was? How will its visit here affect the Israeli elections? It's a controversial thing in Israel right now, okay? His opponents are saying he has mismanaged the American relationship. Others say, well, he's an independent leader of an independent state. But I must ask you to think of this. Imagine for a moment that the United States did not exist. Do you think Israel would have survived? Okay. The American relationship is the life jacket of Israel. Therefore, it should be preserved and kept intact. Now, even his friends say that Netanyahu is a very difficult man to get on with. But he gets on well with Putin and with the Chinese. And Obama is no hotshot in personal relationships either. So, this, anyway, the connections are so close between two societies. I think that this is a very bad and uncomfortable period, embarrassing considerably three groups of people. Embarrassing the American Jewish community, embarrassing Democrats in Congress. Biden is not presiding over that session of Congress. Many Democrat congressmen are going to boycott it. Sheldon Adelson says he won't support them, he'll give money against them, all sorts of problems, okay? And the many organizations that want both nations to get close together. But you know, Obama will be there for 18 months. Netanyahu may lose the election. Even if he wins, the Netanyahu era in Israeli politics is coming to an end. That is, he will be a weak prime minister. He'll have to form a coalition, okay? So I think this will pass in a few months or maybe a year or so. But it's certainly giving a lot of comfort to our enemies in the world, okay? And that is something we shouldn't be so, okay? You know, Democrats in Congress are very embarrassed by this. They want to boycott it because of the procedure, but they don't want to boycott the leader of Israel, okay? So, Vice President of the United States, who is one of those who presides over joint session of Congress, is not going, okay? And Biden is a great friend of Israel, okay? So there are all sorts of complications in this. Sheldon Adelson is a very important figure in this. He's pouring a lot of money into supporting Netanyahu in Israeli elections too. And you know the controversy over his newspaper in Israel. So these are, to my mind, these are unnecessary complications in a relationship which should not reflect those things, okay? Yeah. Okay, a couple more, yes.
We read about the influence of alcohol.
The what?
Influence of alcohol
On whom?
in Russia.
Oh. What's new? Russia has not historically been known for its abstention, okay? In fact, there was one leader who tried to cut back on this. He was one of the last communist leaders called Andropov, okay? And he tried to control availability of vodka. He became so unpopular that he dropped the idea. You know, it may be tradition, it may be the weather, okay? Whatever it is, I don't think man or God can reduce the consumption of alcohol in Russia. But it has certain health impacts on the Russian population at large. Just as smoking in China, long encouraged by the government because it had a monopoly on cigarettes, created a tremendous respiratory problem in China. Now they are beginning to become aware of it, okay? So, on a day like this, you can sympathize with the Russians, right? Yeah. Okay, yes, sir. Yeah. Libya is a very good example of a blowback from American involvement or foreign involvement. Gaddafi was not a nice man, but he was moving close to the West. He had started nuclear weapons. He gave all those up, allowed us to inspect, and so on. However, uprising took place, and we supported his opponents, and he died, was killed. And now Libya has fallen apart into something like Syria. Okay? We are supporting some factions. Islamic extremists are supporting others. Libya, I think, in the end will break up into 3 or 4 different components. Okay, the old Cyrenaica, the old Tripolitania. Okay, and it's a bloody mess of a kind that we hear more of in Syria. Okay, these things, the political collapse, the economic sort of collapse, the religious wars of recent years have brought untold misery to the Middle East. Syria is the best example. A country of 24 million people. Today, in 4 years, 12 million are refugees in their own country. Half the population, 4 million, have fled to neighboring countries, causing a lot of problems there. Food is short, education is short, medical service, and the fighting is going on. From outside, different people are supporting different groups. Libya is something like that. Okay, and once these things start, to end it is very difficult, okay? As we are finding in Iraq. We were there for 11, 12 years, 13 years, and nothing, we're back to where we started, more or less, okay? And when you have these fighting factions, it also gives an opportunity for extremist forces like ISIS and ISIS affiliates in Libya to also rise up and create problems, okay? We were involved with Europe in bombing Libya to get rid of Gaddafi, as you remember. And then the whole can of worms opened. And now it's back and forth. Nobody knows exactly what parts of Libya are held by whom. But we know that there are 3 or 4 forces, General Haftar on one side, some Islamists on the other, former Gaddafi people. It's a snake pit. Okay? Yeah. So, yeah. Sometimes when you get involved in wars of choice, it's a big blowback as a result of that. Get home safely. Thank you for joining me. We meet again on March 15th. I might remind you that I'm having this special session in June with Robin Wright, who you know is a very well-known specialist on the Middle East. It will be after the Israeli elections, and we'll have an opportunity to discuss that also. Thank you. Get home safely.